Hello, this is Eric Johnson, your designated broker here at Skyline. And today I want to talk to you about working with your PSA as well as the buyer brokerage services agreement. It can get a little complex every once in a while. And so we want to be sure that you have an idea about various scenarios and how to work with them. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pop open some forms and we will begin to take a look. Okay, we're going to start with the buyer brokerage services agreement. Now, we're not going to cover the entire agreement right now and all of the language within it, but just covering a couple of key points. Number one, you do need to do this with a buyer before you write up your offer. It should be as soon as practical upon offering real estate services. So in other words, have your buyer consultation appointment. That's a great time to get this signed. Or maybe they don't know you well yet. Maybe you just met them at an open house, whatever it might be. And they want to see your service in action first. After you've shown them a house or two, you should be doing this, and definitely before you write an offer. If you do this after you've written an offer, you run the risk of not getting paid. Okay, so we don't even want to test those waters. So with that, you want to set a term. It defaults to 60 days if you don't do anything, which hopefully is enough time to find a home for your typical buyer. But every once in a while, you're going to have that buyer who's maybe they're just getting started in the process. Maybe they're just figuring it out. The longer you can nail them down, the better. So fill this in with whatever you think is needed for that specific buyer. Be sure and give your buyer a copy of the Real Estate Brokerage in Washington pamphlet. That's pamphlet number P1 on your forms in express forms in the Northwest MLS. I'm going to recommend that unless your buyer is absolutely against the idea, choose exclusive. You want to be their only broker. You don't want to be competing with other brokers for other, or maybe even for the same property. When you work with them, you want to be sure they give you their loyalty and promise your loyalty in exchange. I can see scenarios where maybe you're working with an investor who works with a lot of brokers. Maybe they're going to work with you on specific homes that you might find for them. That might be a situation where non-exclusive would make sense. If you check non-exclusive, verify with that buyer that any other brokers they're working with will also be checking non-exclusive, because that could ace you out of commissions if somebody else if they reach an agreement for exclusive with another broker, but they reach an agreement with you for non-exclusive. Like I say, that could mean that the other broker could get credit. Okay, moving down to the compensation part. And this is the part I really want to focus on and tie this to our PSA. And we're going to bounce back and forth between some forms here. The buyer acknowledges there are no standard compensation rates and that the compensation in this agreement is fully negotiable and not set by law. This is our way of basically saying that, look, there are we as a firm, we as an MLS, we in general do not dictate what the terms are going to be. It's always negotiable. That's what this is basically saying, and we want you to stick to that message. There is no absolute right or wrong amount that your buyer is going to agree to pay you. This next line is probably the most important line on this whole thing. The firm, that's Skyline, on your behalf, that includes you, firm may not receive any compensation for brokerage services provided to buyer from any source greater than the amount set forth in this section 5. Okay, so even if the seller is offering 3%, whatever your buyer puts here in section A5A is going to be the amount that you're entitled to and no more. But this goes on to read, or any subsequent amendment hereto. That's a Form 41A. Let's pop to that real quickly here. Here we can go down to section 5 of 41A, and you can actually check this box and make a change, and that can be done anytime. So say the seller is offering 3%, your buyer only agreed to pay you 1%, and you talk to your buyer and let them know that um, what the seller is offering, and hopefully they are amenable to the idea that you're going to get paid more than what they were offering. And at that point, you could put in 3% here, and then you're covered. So you could do this on a case-by-case basis. We don't recommend doing this all the time. We'd rather that you had a good solid scenario for your Form 41 Part 5, the compensation portion. Starting there is better than trying to get it agreed upon later here, but it is available to you this way. There are going to be scenarios where the seller might be offering nothing, and your buyer offered nothing, then you could change it here. Or if your buyer offers nothing and you want to change it later, you can do it here. Like I say, though, the intent isn't that you don't reach a reasonable agreement with your buyer up front. We prefer that you do that and then come back and use this later, only if needed. Don't be too reliant on this, because it's like anything else in any transaction. Once you've reached mutual acceptance, it's really hard to get other things agreed upon. Your buyer does not have to agree to this 41A at a later date, and you don't want to tie up their transaction because the seller is offering more than what your buyer was offering. So going back to this, we want you to target, negotiate with your buyer. Let them know what's in it for them. That's one of the keys to selling in general. Selling a form like this to your buyer is let them know what's in it for them. Number one, if they put 2.5% here, there's no guarantee that sellers are going to be offering 2.5%, but I will tell you right now, as of this moment, on all brand new listings since August 15th of 2024, 2.5% is the noted buyer broker compensation on 65% of all listings. Another 12% of all listings offer 2%, and 13% of all listings offer 3%. So if we do the math on that, okay, that's another 25% on top of the 65% offering 2.5. Means that 80% of all listings are offering 2% or better. There's a handful of listings out there that are putting in request in offer. When it says request in offer, it means that you get to negotiate. And so this is where it's important that your buyer has offered a certain amount, because you can't ask for more than what they've put here. If the listing says none on the compensation, again, that's an opportunity to negotiate. The seller is basically sending a message that, hey, I don't want to pay any buyer brokerage compensation. But that said, you can still ask. You can put it into your offer. But in that scenario, it's much higher likelihood that your buyer is going to need to compensate you in that scenario. That's another reason where that Form 41A could come into play. Because say the seller says none and they stand firm on none, and you want to get paid by your buyer, well, you're going to need something here. So if your buyer says nothing, if they put on Form 41, if they put in 0%, they weren't willing to risk anything with you, and there might be a good reason for that. This is where you can at least maybe get paid something, okay? You could get paid a dollar amount, or get paid, 1%, or whatever you and the buyer are able to agree upon if the seller is paying none. Okay, so that's kind of the setting the stage here. Now we're going to move into the Form 21. And we're gonna skip Form 21 on down to line number 17. Okay, here it is, the buyer brokerage compensation. This is where you're going to be stating how much you're going, your buyer is stating on their offer how much they want their broker to be paid. So you're typically going to see, like I say, on 80% of all listings, you're going to see 2% or better. It's actually closer to 98% of all listings are offering something, and it's almost always a percentage. So check the percentage box here. So the next space is for the seller's offer. This is what is going to appear in the listing. So if the listing said 2%, you'd write in 2% here, okay? And this percent applies to everything on this line. That's a conversation that we have a lot. There's a semicolon between the two. So that basically means it's a continuation of the same topic, and the topic would be percent or dollar sign. So if whatever the seller is offering under, it'll say BBC or buyer brokerage compensation on the listing. And it could be 2, it could be 2.5, it could be 1, it could be $500, it could be $1,000. In that case, you'd put the dollar sign. But if it's mostly going to be a percentage, like I said earlier, upwards of 98% of all listings have a percentage of some type or other. Then it could also say on the listing, request an offer. And if that's the case, you just put that here. And then you would put in the amount that your buyer has agreed to pay you, no more, because again, on Form 41, it says firm may not receive compensation for brokerage services provided to buyer from any source greater than the amount set forth in this Section 5 or any subsequent amendment hereto. If your buyer gave you 0, then theoretically you're not going to get paid, because all you could ask for is 0 here. That's the most you can ever ask for, is what your buyer says. So in that case, you'd have to do Form 41A and at least ask for something from your buyer, with the idea that hopefully the seller will pay that as well. You may have to amend this again later if, so say your buyer fills in Form 41 with 3%, okay? And so therefore you ask the seller for 3%. The seller can then counter this in an offer counter offer scenario, and they could come back and put in a lesser amount. If that happens, then your buyer, in theory, so say the seller comes back, counters you, and says 2%. In theory, your buyer owes you 1% at this point, but maybe they don't have the 1% or don't want to pay you the 1%. Then you'd go into Form 41A and change it to 2% and get that signed around at the same time that you're agreeing to the counter offer, and everybody is covered. Your buyer doesn't have to go out of their pocket. You're still going to get 2%. Another scenario that could happen is where the seller says none. Hey, that's what you'd type in here, is seller's offer none. By the way, side note, you have to fill in both of these blanks. If you don't, you're not going to get paid. Okay, so be sure and fill it in. It's got to be filled in accurately. The seller, whatever they're offering, you have to fill that in accurately. What you're going to get paid, again, can't exceed what your buyer's offering you unless you and your buyer are going to be doing an amendment later. So again, on none, it could be that you're not going to ask the seller to pay you anything, because it's been made very clear that the seller will not, under any circumstances, entertain an offer where they are having to pay buyer brokerage compensation. Hopefully the seller's price reflects that. That's been one of the things that's been on my mind, is that they they're competing with other offers that are paying, again, for the most part, 65% of all the offers they're competing with are going to be offering 2.5%. And again, there is no set amount of commission that is necessary. But that said, hopefully this seller is pricing their home accordingly, so your buyer's not getting double dipped, because your buyer ultimately is the one making the payment, right? So if they pay the full listing price that is made up of comps that we're offering 2.5%, and then your buyer offers you 2.5% on top of that, your buyer is in theory paying you 5%. So it's not fair. Therefore, the seller should be pricing their home accordingly. You know, they don't want to pay the commission, that's fine, but it doesn't mean that their home value should be reflecting a value that includes the commission. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Anyway, so if they do none, you can put in, again, anything that your buyer says on Form 41. If he said 3%, you can put it in here. The seller can come back and counter you anywhere from 0 to the amount that you're offering. You know, they wouldn't be countering if it's the amount you're offering. So just know that that's all negotiable. Know that you are tied to Form 41 as to what you are able to even ask for there, but you can make an amendment on Form 41A. Form 41 is intended to happen long before you look at, you know, this house. It's intended to happen as soon as you start offering real estate services, which means as soon as you basically talk to people, somebody about becoming their broker. That's it. And as soon as you start sending them listings, that's a real estate service. So in theory, you're doing this well ahead of time. You have no idea what's going to be offered on any individual listing. Personally, if I was working with a buyer, I would probably try to convince them to go with 2.5%, and we'd work with that. Your buyer could also say a dollar amount. That can get a little hard to work with sometimes when what you write on the Form 21, if they're offering 3%, you know, and your buyer is saying that you'll get $10,000, you know, then, you know, it could be, you know, there's some math that will have to take place in that scenario. Okay. Okay. So those are the basic scenarios you're going to run into. Now we're going to deal with some other things that are going on. So say the seller is offering 2.5%. Seller agreed to pay us 2%. Shall be credited to buyer's obligations at closing. So what this is saying is, hey, seller, you were willing to pay 2.5%. The buyer had agreed to only 2%, but the buyer wishes to receive the rest. Okay, so that other 0.5% in this case, in this example, is going to go to the buyer's obligations, which would be their closing costs or other fees. So, and then it goes on to say here, if the buyer is obtaining a loan or loans to purchase the property, the seller's credit to the buyer is subject to the buyer's lender's approval. Okay, any amount not approved by the buyer's lender. So in other words, it will go towards their closing costs as long as the lender agrees to that. If the lender doesn't allow it to go towards their closing costs, then you can check a box. It will say it's applied as a reduction in the purchase price. That won't feel as good to a seller, although it's basically the same money. So the net to the seller is, for all intents, essentially the same. When you reduce the purchase price, it does reduce the amount of excise tax the seller has to pay. Also reduces the amount of compensation they have to pay to both their listing broker and any buyer brokerage firm compensation. Or the other side that would feel like more of a win to the seller is if it's credited back to the seller. So the seller has closing costs too. They've got prepaids. They've got their taxes. They've got prorated things they've got to deal with. So in this case, it would be 0.5% that the seller would actually not have to pay, which basically is the same as putting money back in their pocket, if you will. So that could be a choice that would cause a seller to accept your offer in that situation. So the other one, so hopefully that all makes sense. That can be dollar amounts, but whenever your buyer is offering less than what the seller is offering, your buyer is entitled to the difference through a buyer credit. If you don't check this box, they're not entitled to it, and neither are you. So you'll just get the 2% in that case, because that's what they offered on their Form 41. And again, if you want to change that 2% to reflect the 2.5%, okay, then you would, so say you had 2% here, but you wanted to change that to 2.5% to line up with what the seller was offering. You can do that with an amendment. And then you would do it here as well. But you wouldn't do the addendum for buyer credit because these are equal amounts. There is no credit to be had. If your buyer wants you to rebate them a portion of your compensation, you can do that as well. That's going to be between you and your buyer. And so that can be done. Form 90 is what I recommend because that is just a notice that's between you and your buyer. And in here, it would just, say that the buyer broker agrees to provide buyer with up to a certain dollar amount towards their allowable closing costs from the buyer brokerage firm compensation. Okay, there you go. You've got it covered. So that's one way of doing it. Okay, so now say the seller is offering less than your buyer is, then then it can be a little more challenging. Say they're offering 1%, your buyer agreed to give you 2%. You would just put 1% here, and because or say it got countered back to 1%. Say the seller is insistent, they're not going to pay any more than 1%, and your buyer is okay with paying you that difference. You don't need to do a modification. So you're going to get 1% from your buyer and 1% from your seller. So in that case, this is where things get a little tricky. You are going to put in on your Form 40, 1%. So say it's a $500,000 listing, you'll get 1% of that would be $5,000 to Skyline. Okay, you fill it in more than that, by the way, but just for brevity's sake here. Then you would do a Form 40A, which most of you have never seen or heard of before. On Form 40A, this is the part where it's coming from your buyer, and your buyer actually has to sign off on this. And they're going to be paying you 1% as well. So it's another $5,000 to Skyline. Okay, so that's the basics of how that would work. If your buyer is paying you, you'll have two compensation agreements. They'll both go to escrow. Escrow will know to ask your buyer for $5,000 in addition to any closing costs and down payments they have to bring to the table for closing. They'll bring $5,000 that will come to you. And likewise, escrow will know that from the listing that you're or from the selling side, you're also going to be receiving $5,000 in buyer brokerage compensation. Now there is this, we were talking earlier about a scenario where the buyer gets credited a certain amount on a Form 90, where you are going to give back a portion of what you get to the buyer. Then you also need to use not Form 90, but also that this should reflect. So say it was a 3% on a $500,000 property. So that'd be $10,000 would go to Skyline, and say 1%, you were going to give 1% of it back to your buyer. And you did that on that Form 90. You can also do it on a Form 34, but then the seller has to agree to it as well. Then you say, you put in your buyer's name. So, then you put in just something like that. You can ask escrow how they would like to see it. You won't put an address or anything. Your buyer's not going to receive a check. They're not going to receive any income, but we do have to account for the commission that's coming in order, you have to, it has to be dispersed, okay? And we just have to allocate how it's dispersed. This way, at least it doesn't come to Skyline. It isn't taxable income for you. Okay, it comes off pre-tax this way. So there you go. That's the basic scenarios. I do hope that this was this was enlightening. I do encourage you to contact your manager anytime you've got questions. If you're not working with a straight, say if you're not receiving exactly what the seller's offering, then there are a lot of different scenarios that can take place. Talk to your manager about this, and we can help you strategize if there's strategy that's needed. We can help you talk to your buyer. In other words, talk to your buyer in a way that will be meaningful to your buyer so that they understand what's in it for them. By maybe if on Form 41 previously, they hadn't agreed to anything here. I know that's a simple conversation. Hey, don't worry about it, buyer. You're never going to have to do that. And we'll use an amendment form later if we have to. That's acceptable, but it's not perfect because the idea is being transparent right up front. So that said, anytime you've got a variation from what the seller is offering to what your buyer's offering. If the seller's offering 2.5 and your buyer's offering 2.5, great. 2 and 2, great. But as soon as there's a difference between the two, where it says maybe request in offer, that's going to be different than what your seller is offering you. It could be where it's a none situation. And again, that's going to be different than what your buyer's offering you. These are conversations that are going to need to be had with your buyer as to what's going to happen, in that scenario, and how are you going to get paid at all in that scenario, et cetera. So just be sure and talk to us. We want to help you get there, and there are ways to do it that are hopefully a win for everybody. I know the big topic is that our buyers don't want to, they may not have the money to dip into their own pocket to pay you between their closing costs and their down payment and what have you. And maybe they still need to buy furniture for their home, or maybe they're going to be they're going to be buying window coverings, who knows what. They don't have the money to pay you. If the seller's not paying you, then we need to figure that out. So, but there's also ways that if the seller is paying, that you can help your buyer out as well. So that's always part of the conversation, is that, look, this is what's in it for you, buyer. If you do offer me compensation, and the seller offers more, I'm going to give you that difference back. I'm also going to give you part of my compensation as upfront, but I can only ask for as much as you put in here. So therefore, the more you ask for here, the more I can ask from the seller. And if the seller agrees to it, it means I'm going to be giving you more towards your closing costs, which means less out of your pocket that you can use towards that furniture or towards a buy down on your interest rate or who knows what. Okay, so hopefully that's useful information. And that's it. Again, call your manager anytime you've got a variation there, anytime you've got something different going on, so that we can help you get to the right place. Okay, so that is it.